According to Matthew, Jesus began his ministry in Galilee, not far from where he grew up. In fact, he was teaching and healing those who were his neighbours. Word about his caring ministry spread like wildfire, and soon wherever he went, a great crowd gathered, all hungry to listen to what he had to say, and perhaps even more importantly, to be healed from whatever ailed them. It was in response to this great crowd that Jesus preached the famous Sermon on the Mount. Matthew tells us that shortly after that sermon, Jesus went to the nearby town, just up the coast of Galilee, of Capernaum, where Peter lived. It was probably the closest thing that Jesus had as a home as well, and it was the base of his early ministry. When Jesus was there, Peter's mother-in-law fell gravely ill, and Jesus healed her. As soon as she got well, she returned to the task of serving. That evening, another crowd began to gather round his home in Capernaum. Everyone is looking for Jesus to heal their grave illnesses too. It's not hard for a preacher to sell people the idea that Jesus can heal us or mend the brokenness in our lives. We all have strained relationships, broken dreams, and hurts that we would love Jesus to heal. Again, according to Matthew, that's how the gospel starts. Jesus comes into our home as Saviour. Perhaps it's because he wants to heal us from whatever has paralysed us, hurt or guilt or fear, for example. But eventually the time comes when Jesus makes it clear that our paralysis is healed. It's time to get up and back to serving like Peter's mother-in-law. This brings us to a verse that I want to concentrate on today. After all of this healing in Peter's house in Capernaum, we're told, now when Jesus saw the great crowds around him, he gave orders to go over to the other side. Now that's a very important line for Matthew. And before we go to the rest of the text, we need to pause over that phrase. Jesus said it's time to go over to the other side. On the surface level, that statement means that it was time to get into the boats and cross Galilee, go over to the other side. But on the other side of the Sea of Galilee was the city of Gadara, one of the 10 cities built by the Greeks in the 4th century BC, and known as Decapolis. Now, Gadara was not Galilee. It was not Jewish. It was a stronghold of the Roman Empire. They raised pigs. As soon as Jesus and whoever followed him stepped out of the boat at Gadara, the good religious people at home would regard him and them as being defiled. So for Jesus to say it's time to go over the other side is also to say, I have not just come to minister to you, I've also come for them. I am not just about you, I am also about those on the other side of the religious walls that we build. Those whose lives are far from holy, those who also need a Saviour. We live in a world full of divisions. One division that has been in the headlines is that which was laid bare by the death of George Floyd, which sparked the Black Lives Matter protest, beginning in the United States, but soon travelling around the world, not least in Britain. Now, these demonstrations were during the current pandemic. They were illegal and potentially dangerous. But the Black Lives Matter movement said that racism is even more deadly than coronavirus. It wasn't long before there was a kickback in the media. Methinks they do protest too much, was the gist of what some people were saying. And they certainly didn't like some of the ways of protest. One practical way of overcoming division is to cross over to the other side. Experience life as it's lived by those from whom we are divided. Now, to do that, we need to use our imagination. if I lived in that area under those pressures, with that set of experiences, and I was part of an ethnic minority, what would life be like for me? We can widen the argument. What it's like to have me as a husband or a wife. What's it like to have me for a son or a daughter or a neighbour or a workmate? Or any relationship that is under strain. Once we ask those questions, we begin to understand what his life is like for other people. And then understand also some of their attitudes and the reason for them being the kind of people that they are. And once we know that we are on the road, then not only to understanding, but overcoming division. There's another sense in which we have to cross over on the other side. To be real disciples of Jesus means we have to cross over from being a receiver of grace to a giver. Faith starts with us being a receiver of God's grace. But it can't end there. But for too many people, it does. To follow Jesus means that we have received. Now it is time for us to give. You have been blessed. Now is the time for you to be a blessing. We could almost say that Jesus is inviting us to a second conversion. The first conversion is when we realize how much we need a Saviour. The second one is being converted away from our own life. It's about going with Jesus to the other side of discipleship, where we're givers. You're never really a disciple unless you follow him there. We live in an age described as an age of entitlement, where we seem to have the right to be the receivers all the time. It's also been described as a narcissistic age. In the ancient story of Narcissus, Narcissus was a young man renowned for his beauty, who caught sight of himself in a reflection in water. He fell in love with himself, and unable to tear himself away from that reflection, he stared at himself until he died. It's a story of someone obsessed with himself, unwilling to help others. That ultimately kills him. To be a disciple of Jesus means we have to be prepared to give ourselves to other people. Generosity is opposite to the spirit of narcissism. A man comes up to Jesus and says, "You can count on me. I will follow you wherever you go." Now that's saying a lot, because Jesus made it clear that he was heading to Gentile territory. We are also saying a lot when we say we will cross over to the other side of discipleship and become a giver. It's a good choice, but Jesus wants to make clear the cost of that choice. Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. In other words, I don't really have a home, and I am not only going to stay in yours. So if you follow me, be ready to cross over and become a giver. Well, what does that mean? I'm not really talking about financial generosity, although let it be said that while Jesus has very little to say with our modern obsession over sexuality, he had a great deal to say about wealth and the dangers of money. No man can serve two masters. You cannot serve God and money, he said. You can learn a great deal about someone by looking at their credit card bill, what they spend their money on, whether or not they're willing to be generous in helping others, or whether their life is focused only on themselves. The opposite of generosity is mean-spiritedness. Often the people who have most are the least willing to share. But if we're not talking specifically about money, what does it mean to be a giver? Well, we can be generous with our encouragement. We can be generous with praise. We can be generous with practical help. We can be generous in making allowances for others and not rush to judgment. We can be generous with forgiveness. To truly love Jesus is not to ask what we can get out of faith. Once you're a disciple, you have crossed over and become a giver. Giving for us as followers of Jesus is as natural as every breath that we take. The choice is always before us. On the one hand, a life focused on our own needs. But that turns out to be a barren, unsatisfying way of life. On the other hand, there's the way of life that Jesus calls us to. Now, there are many reasons not to heed that call. Not to cross over to the other side and become givers and bearers of grace. And really, only one reason in favour. It alone leads to fullness of life. Thanks be to God. Amen.